I'm going to talk about some work we've been doing at CIFOR and also in collaboration with PIM. I'll talk about that today in the afternoon in the session on collaborations. It's called, so this work is called Puzzle Pieces or Poker Chips. Do multi-stakeholder forums promote social inclusion? So just some background, multi-stakeholder forums, which under PIM we call multi-stakeholder platforms, so MSFs, MSPs, are discussed in the land use and land use change and forestry sector as a transformative method of decision-making, coordination, and management. They create an expectation of a space where underrepresented actors can hold other powerful actors accountable. What we found, however, is that most organizers in our sample see the method just by inviting people to the table is enough to balance power relations, whereas the indigenous peoples who are participating in these, and also non-participants, we also interview non-participants, don't see them as such, but do see their potential. So the idea of this research is to get a sense of what really happens in multi-stakeholder forums. So looking at multi-stakeholder forums and inclusion through the lens of accountability, what we see is that the method promises a more transparent and equitable process and outcomes that are more inclusive of underrepresented actors. They should allow for equal participation, empowering them to hold governments and NGOs accountable in relation to the activities that they're carrying on and the ones that impact their lives and priorities and rights. But what we want to know is how are MSFs addressing these power relations and inequity in order to assure accountability in their processes and outcomes. So a quote here from someone in the room, all modes of accountability are relational. To understand its nature, we need to attend to the actors between whom relations of accountability exist. Accountability is also about the mechanisms through which counterpowers are exercised by those subject to actors holding power. Accountability in this sense, to paraphrase Foucault, is not in a position of exteriority to power, but depends on the exercise of a counterpower to balance arbitrary action. So this study, I'm not going to go very much into the methods because I don't have time, but I'm happy to answer questions afterwards. We took a study of 14 multi-stakeholder forums in 4 different countries. They're all organized around specific subnational geographies of land use, some kind of land use management or change. There are 4 in Peru, 4 in Brazil, 1 was actually national in Brazil, 2 in Ethiopia, and 4 in Indonesia. We used multiple sets of methods. So we used one called the Q method, where we talked to people about we're able to judge their attitudes, and I'll present some of those results in a minute. It allows you to divide people into groups based on their perspectives on the forums. We also talked to some of the innovative things about this is we not only talked to the participants of the forums, but we also interviewed non-participants around the forums, people who had been invited who didn't come, or who came once and then never went back, or people who others said ought to have been invited. So we analyzed the Q method results so far just for Peru. And we were able, through this factoring process, to divide them into different groups. And they're quite strikingly some of the things that played out in terms of our hypotheses. So just for Peru, we found one group we could call the idealists. That was about 1/3 of the group, where people believed in this ideal of the multi-stakeholder forum. They present an equal playing field, and they balance power inequalities. And so the main people in this was very mixed, but the organizers of forums were predominant in this particular group. We had another group that we call the negotiators. They were about 28%. And they also were optimistic about the forum, but they believed that it was an important negotiating process that offered a space for dialogue that could lead to the consensus outcomes. And a lot of the indigenous organizations were in this particular group. We also had a very small group that were the skeptics. They were the ones who believed that the MSFs could be successful if they included protections for rights and things like this, but most of all, they thought that they could be manipulated and were really problematic. And the government we found actually in this group. And the final group was also about 1/3 were the pragmatists. And they were ones who believed that they could be effective if underrepresented actors had their capacities developed. And on the one hand, you could see that kind of coincides with indigenous peoples who also wanted more capacities. But what we found is the overall responses we got around these questions were more about, government officials as well saying, we know what we want. We know these guys have to implement it. We just need to train them so they'll do it right. So that's why we're calling them the pragmatists. So in most cases, the organizers, again, see the forum itself as balancing the power relations, as a space for dialogue where everyone is heard. And this was, again, the optimistic side of this. Coming back to the title of the puzzle pieces are poker chips, right? Most people see this as we're all coming together to solve a puzzle. But if accountability is a relation, then the fact that the multi-stakeholder forums are seen by organizers as the way to address power imbalances simply by having them at the table clearly contrasts with the point of view of the indigenous peoples we interviewed as being able to hold people, those who have more power, to account. So if accountability is related to power, here's what we found when we actually looked at the interviews with indigenous peoples who were both participants and non-participants of the forum. And we only have examined so far 7 of the forums to the level of this data. So 1 out of 7, the multi-stakeholder forum was perceived by the indigenous peoples to actively address power differentials. This was in Acre, Brazil. And if anyone knows about Acre, you'll know why this was the exception. It's been an exceptional place for the last 20 years. It's where the rubber tapper movement was. What was interesting is that they thought that the playing field was leveled, not in the forum, but by the context around the forum. Simply by the history of the region, they felt that this forum was, in fact, a level playing field. In the other 6 of 7 multi-stakeholder forums, the indigenous peoples saw themselves at a disadvantage, ranging from the organizers not taking them into account, not taking into account disparities in their technical knowledge, or directly excluding them even when the issues affected them. Some were unable to participate due to there not being enough funding to get them to the forum. Some were not invited, or they felt that they lacked the language or capacity to understand exactly what was going on and what was being discussed. Other people chose not to participate because they had the experience of not being heard, of multi-stakeholder forums not having outcomes that they felt were actually implementable or that did not represent their interests or positions, as well as because of their mistrust of other actors. So being brought together in conversation with other actors was noted as a positive aspect, generally, even among the skeptics. The majority of non-participants, even non-participants, believed that multi-stakeholder forums could be a transformative solution if they were truly inclusive, either providing quotas, funds for participation, as well as capacity development, and if they led to actually enforceable and binding results that represented the priorities of the indigenous peoples themselves. If not, then they didn't think that the forum was the right way to go. Social action or one-on-one discussions with the government were definitely preferable. So what does this tell us about multi-stakeholder forums for social inclusion? First of all, again, the organizers don't see power as something to resolve within the multi-stakeholder forum because they see this as solving power by itself. Whereas indigenous peoples are thinking more about participation as holding people to account, while the organizers, again, are thinking about simply providing them a seat at the table. So when can they actually empower indigenous peoples to hold more powerful people accountable? First of all, the contexts are way too varied to have a silver bullet. That's one really important point. The point of just having people at the table is not enough. There's all these other aspects to justice, which include addressing the context and the context of inequality around the forums. And we also propose that we really need a different approach to stakeholder engagement, which is more about really engaging people and establishing these activities as social learning activities, having the humility to recognize we don't have all the answers coming in from the outside, which of course working with governments can be somewhat challenging. And that's it. Thanks.